the glittering halls of Versailles, where power was measured in whispered secrets and silken glances, one woman rose from the bourgeois streets of Paris to become the unofficial queen of France. Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson, who would immortalize herself as Madame de Pompadour, was born on December 29, 1721, in a world that would never accept her, yet which she would ultimately command with an iron will wrapped in velvet. The cobblestones of the Rue de Cléry bore witness to her first steps, where her father, François Poisson, struggled as a steward to the Paris brothers, financiers whose fortunes rose and fell with the volatile tides of French economics. Her mother, Louise Madeleine de la Motte, possessed the kind of beauty that opened doors and loosened purse strings, a talent she would pass to her daughter, along with an understanding of how power truly operated in the shadows of respectability. When scandal forced François to flee France, leaving his family behind like chess pieces abandoned mid-game, young Jeanne-Antoinette learned her first lesson in survival: that a woman's wit could prove sharper than any sword. Her mother's protector, Charles-François Lenormand de Tournayhem, stepped into the void not as a father, but as an architect of destiny, recognizing in the child's intelligent eyes the raw material of greatness. Under Tournayhem's guidance, the girl received an education that would have been the envy of many nobles' sons. Languages flowed from her tongue like music, while her fingers danced across harpsichord keys with the same grace that would later navigate the treacherous waters of court politics. She learned to paint with delicate precision, to recite poetry with passion, and most importantly, to think several moves ahead in the grand game of influence. At 9 years old, a fortune-teller named Madame Le Bon gazed into Jeanne-Antoinette's palm and spoke words that would echo through history. "You will reign over the heart of a king." The child's eyes sparkled with possibility, and from that moment, every lesson, every conversation, every carefully chosen dress became a step toward an impossible throne. Marriage came at 19 to Charles-Guillaume Lenormand de Tilliols, Tournayhem's nephew, a union that provided respectability and wealth, but could never contain the vastness of her ambitions. In the elegant salons of Paris, she held court among philosophers and artists. Her wit, as sharp as her beauty, was luminous. Voltaire himself praised her intelligence, while her laugh could make even the most jaded courtier believe in magic. But Louis XV, the most powerful man in Europe, remained tantalizingly beyond reach, protected by protocol and surrounded by mistresses whose names were whispered in fear and envy. The king had grown bored with his current favorite, Madame de Châteauroux, whose recent death had left a void that ambitious women throughout France sought to fill. Jeanne-Antoinette listened to these whispers like a hunter tracking prey through moonlit forests, understanding that timing would be as crucial as beauty in claiming the ultimate prize. The forest of Sénart became her stage for the most audacious performance of her life. She appeared at the royal hunts, not as a participant, but as a vision that haunted the king's peripheral vision. Dressed in blue, then in pink, she rode her carriage along the forest paths like a figure from a fairy tale, beautiful and unattainable, her presence as calculated as it was enchanting. Each appearance was choreographed to perfection, designed to intrigue rather than pursue, to tantalize rather than surrender. Louis XV, accustomed to having women throw themselves at his feet, found himself intrigued by this mysterious beauty who appeared and disappeared like morning mist. Through intermediaries, inquiries were made, and the game began in earnest. She was invited to a masked ball at Versailles on February 25, 1745, disguised as Diana the Huntress, while the king came as a tree, a symbolism that would prove prophetic, as she would plant herself deep in the royal heart and grow into an influence that would prove impossible to uproot. Their conversation at that ball lasted through the night, two minds recognizing kindred intelligence across the chasm of social convention. She spoke not of fashion or gossip, but of literature and philosophy, challenging him with ideas rather than flattering him with empty praise. When he mentioned his melancholy over the burdens of kingship, she offered not sympathy, but solutions, discussing governance with the acuity of a trained statesman. By dawn, The king was utterly captivated, and by summer she had been installed at Versailles as his official mistress. The transformation from Madame d'Étiole to Madame de Pompadour required more than a change of name. It demanded the creation of an entirely new kind of royal mistress. Where previous favorites had been content with jewels and apartments, Pompadour understood that true power lay in making herself indispensable to the king's mind as well as his heart. She studied his moods with the dedication of a scholar, learning to anticipate his needs before he himself recognized them. She revolutionized the role through intellectual partnership, becoming Louis XV's closest advisor on matters of state, art, and culture. Her apartments at Versailles became the true center of French power, where policies were debated and decisions made over delicate cups of chocolate and elegant conversation. Ministers learned to court her favor as assiduously as they had once courted the king's, understanding that her word carried the weight of royal decree. The enemies were numerous and vicious. The old nobility despised her bourgeois origins, dubbing her Madame Whorefish in cruel reference to her family name. The church condemned her influence over a married king, with priests delivering sermons that barely disguised their attacks on her person. Queen Marie Leszczyńska, though powerless to prevent the liaison, regarded her with barely concealed hatred, knowing that this woman commanded her husband's attention as she never could. Court ladies who had expected to see her fall within months watched in growing alarm as her position solidified into something approaching permanence. But Pompadour possessed weapons her enemies had not anticipated. She understood that the king's greatest fear was boredom, and she became his defense against the suffocating routine of royal life. She organized elaborate theatrical performances where she often starred alongside professional actors, her natural grace and intelligence making her as compelling on stage as in the drawing room. She commissioned stunning artworks that transformed Versailles into a gallery of contemporary taste and created new fashions that kept the court in a perpetual state of delighted anticipation. Her influence extended far beyond the bedroom, reaching into every corner of French cultural life. She discovered and patronized artists like François Boucher, whose sensual paintings of mythological scenes perfectly captured the elegance and refinement of her era. Under her protection, Jean-Baptiste Greuze developed his distinctive style of emotionally charged portraiture, while Jean-Honoré Fragonard created the Rococo masterpieces that would define 18th-century French art. She collected books with the passion of a true bibliophile, amassing a library that rivaled those of universities and contained works in multiple languages on subjects ranging from natural philosophy to ancient history. Her support launched careers and destroyed reputations with equal efficiency. A word of praise from Pompadour could elevate an unknown artist to international fame, while her disapproval could end promising careers before they truly began. Yet she wielded this power with remarkable judgment, rarely allowing personal feelings to override artistic merit. Even those who despised her politics acknowledged that her taste was impeccable and her support genuinely beneficial to French culture. The 7 Years' War tested her political acumen as France struggled against a coalition of enemies led by Frederick the Great of Prussia and supported by British gold. While military leaders like Marshal Soubise stumbled through disastrous campaigns, Pompadour worked tirelessly behind the scenes to maintain the crucial alliance with Austria that had reversed centuries of Habsburg-Bourbon rivalry. Her correspondence with foreign diplomats, including personal letters to Empress Maria Theresa, revealed a mind capable of grasping complex geopolitical realities that eluded many professional politicians. She understood that war was won as much through economic endurance as military victory, and she used her influence to secure loans and manage the royal finances that kept French armies in the field. Her enemies accused her of profiteering from military contracts, but evidence suggests she often used her own considerable wealth to cover government shortfalls rather than enriching herself at public expense. Even as the king's romantic ardor cooled in the late 1740s, their intellectual partnership deepened into something unprecedented in royal history. She managed the transition from lover to friend with such skill that her position actually strengthened rather than weakened. This transformation required sacrificing her claim to exclusive physical intimacy while gaining something far more valuable: irreplaceable political influence. She became, in effect, the king's prime minister in all but name, consulted on every major decision, and trusted with state secrets that she guarded with absolute discretion. Her cultural legacy emerged through ambitious projects that would outlast dynasties. The École Militaire rose under her patronage, its neoclassical architecture housing an institution that would train the officers who would serve France through revolution and empire. The Sèvres porcelain factory, which she rescued from bankruptcy and relocated to her estate, produced masterpieces that defined European taste and competed successfully with the renowned products of Meissen and Chinese kilns. Her support for Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, despite its controversial ideas that challenged religious and political orthodoxy, demonstrated her commitment to intellectual progress over comfortable conformity. The financial cost of her position was staggering, with estimates suggesting she spent the equivalent of millions of modern dollars annually on clothing, jewels, and entertainment. But Pompadour understood that magnificence was not mere vanity, but a political necessity in a society where appearance communicated power as effectively as armies or edicts. Her constantly changing wardrobe set fashion trends across Europe, while her jewels served as diplomatic gifts that cemented alliances and flattered foreign dignitaries. Every louis d'or spent was an investment in maintaining power that could not be measured in traditional economic terms. As the 1750s progressed, her health began to fail under the constant stress of maintaining her impossible position. The tuberculosis that would eventually claim her life manifested first as a persistent cough that she disguised with elaborate fans and carefully timed withdrawals from public view. Yet even illness could not diminish her determination to shape France's destiny, and she continued her exhausting schedule of receptions, correspondence, and cultural patronage despite growing physical weakness. Her apartments became a salon where the greatest minds of the Enlightenment gathered to debate ideas that would eventually topple the very system that had elevated her. Voltaire, despite his satirical attacks on court life, recognized in her a kindred spirit who appreciated wit and tolerated intellectual independence. Diderot and d'Alembert found in her not just a patron, but an intellectual equal who could engage with their most complex theories while navigating the practical realities of implementing progressive ideas within an absolute monarchy. The common people of France, struggling under the weight of taxation required to fund royal magnificence and foreign wars, blamed her for their suffering in ways they never dared blame the king himself. Popular songs mocked her origins and extravagance, while satirical prints portrayed her as a demon draining the nation's blood. After us, the deluge became associated with her name, though she probably never spoke these prophetic words. Yet she continued to support charitable causes and patronize public works that benefited ordinary citizens, understanding that her legacy would be judged not only by her cultural achievements, but by her compassion for the less fortunate. Her relationship with Louis XV evolved into something that defied easy categorization: part political partnership, part intellectual companionship, part emotional dependency. The king, who had grown increasingly melancholy and suspicious with age, found in her the one person who could lift his spirits and engage his interest in the burdens of rulership. Their daily conversations ranged from the intimate details of court intrigue to grand questions of national policy, creating a bond that transcended the usual dynamics of royal mistresses and their patrons. By the early 1760s, it became clear that her body was failing even as her mind remained sharp as ever. The coughing fits grew more severe, and the careful application of rouge could no longer disguise the pallor that spoke of approaching death. Yet she continued her duties with the dedication of a true public servant, receiving visitors, managing correspondence, and advising the king as if each day might stretch into eternity. Her courage in facing mortality became legendary, with even her enemies grudgingly admitting their admiration for her grace under the ultimate pressure. Her final project was the Petit Trianon, an intimate palace that would serve as a retreat from the overwhelming grandeur of Versailles. Though she would not live to see its completion, the building embodied her aesthetic vision, elegant without ostentation, comfortable without sacrificing beauty, a place where power could be exercised through charm rather than intimidation. The structure would later become Marie Antoinette's favorite refuge, though history would judge the Austrian queen's use of it far more harshly than it had Pompadour's intentions. As winter gave way to spring in 1764, Pompadour's condition deteriorated rapidly. The king visited her daily, their conversations now focusing on practical matters. The succession of her protégés, the completion of unfinished projects, the preservation of the cultural institutions she had created. She dictated letters, ensuring that her servants would be cared for, and that artists under her protection would continue to receive support. Their farewells were conducted with the same grace that had characterized their entire relationship. Two remarkable individuals preparing to part after nearly 20 years of unprecedented collaboration. On April 15, 1764, at the age of 42, Madame de Pompadour died in her apartments at Versailles, surrounded by servants who had served her with devotion that transcended mere duty. The king, prohibited by protocol from visiting her deathbed, watched from a balcony as her coffin was carried away through the rain, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "She is the only woman who never caused me a moment's uneasiness." His grief was genuine and profound, for he had lost not just a companion, but the one person who had truly understood the weight of his crown. Her funeral procession through Paris revealed the complex legacy she left behind. While critics had mocked her in life, her death was mourned by artists, intellectuals, and craftsmen whose careers she had fostered. The institutions she had founded, the cultural standards she had established, and the political precedents she had set would influence French society long after her physical presence had vanished. Even her enemies acknowledged that an era had ended with her passing, though none could have predicted how quickly the world she had helped create would crumble in revolution. In the decades following her death, as revolution consumed the monarchy she had served so faithfully, historians began to recognize the true scope of her achievement. She had not merely been a royal mistress, but a cultural force who had shaped the intellectual landscape of her era. Her patronage had fostered artistic movements that defined European taste, while her political acumen had influenced policies that affected millions. The Enlightenment ideals she had supported would eventually contribute to the very revolution that destroyed the system she had served, creating one of history's most poignant ironies. The portraits that survive her show a woman of extraordinary beauty, but they cannot capture the intelligence that burned behind her eyes or the determination that drove her to transform an impossible position into genuine power. She had proven that in the game of influence, birth mattered less than brilliance, and that a woman armed with wit and will could reshape the world around her despite every disadvantage of gender and class. Madame de Pompadour's story resonates across the centuries as a testament to the power of ambition tempered by intelligence. She understood that true influence required more than beauty or charm. It demanded the ability to make oneself indispensable through excellence in every endeavor. Her life proved that even in the most rigid hierarchies, exceptional individuals could transcend the circumstances of their birth to leave indelible marks on history. Today, as we struggle with questions of power, influence, and the role of women in shaping society, Pompadour's example remains startlingly relevant. She demonstrated that leadership could be exercised through culture and ideas as effectively as through traditional authority, and that the most lasting impact comes from nurturing talent and fostering intellectual progress rather than simply accumulating wealth or status. In the end, Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson achieved something far greater than her childhood fortune teller had predicted. She did not merely reign over a king's heart. She ruled over an entire era, shaping the cultural and intellectual landscape of 18th century Europe with a vision that continues to influence our understanding of art, beauty, and power itself. Her legacy stands as proof that true greatness lies not in the circumstances of one's birth, but in the courage to envision a different world and the intelligence to make that vision reality.